Welcome to lesson 12 of our cultural diversity training. This lesson is about individuals and families of Latin descent. So this lesson is going to invite us to kind of explore one of the most vibrant, diverse, and influential populations in the U.S. And this is the community is broadly known as the Latina or Latino, Latin, or Hispanic community. So as counselors, our goal is to move beyond the labels and the statistics and really understand people's lived realities. What are their cultural strengths, their migration stories, the complex intersections of their faith and their family and resilience? Latinos, Latinas, they now represent over 19% of the total US population, and that number is continuing to grow very rapidly. In fact, that by 2050, 1 in 4 US residents is going to be able to trace their heritage back to Latin America. So that means that nearly every counselor, regardless of their specialty or their region, is going to serve a Latino or Latina client or one of their family members. So throughout this lesson, we're going to look at some of the historical migration patterns that shape the communities. We're going to look at some of the cultural values like familismo, respeto, personalismo, and all of those are going to define the interpersonal relationships. The ongoing effects, we're going to look at some of the ongoing effects of the immigration policy and acculturation and social stress, and some of the extraordinary strengths that are emerging from faith and family and cultural pride. So as we're moving through these slides here, just remember that cultural competence isn't about memorizing their customs. It's about humility and context and genuine curiosity. And each client that you meet is going to carry generations of history and sacrifice and hope. So to understand Latin American clients, we must first ground ourselves in the region's historical roots. Before colonization, Latin America was home to some really sophisticated indigenous civilizations like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incans, the Taínos, and hundreds of others. And these cultures really possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and agriculture and architecture and medicine. And their traditions of community and spirituality are still echoing in modern Latin identities. So in 1492, we have the arrival of the European colonizers. And primarily these are like the Spanish and the Portuguese. And they began centuries of conquest. And the colonization reshaped the entire hemisphere. So these indigenous peoples were decimated by war and disease, and Africans were enslaved and they were transported across the Atlantic, and the European religion and that language started to be imposed on those people. But even with all of this violence comes this remarkable blending of the cultures. You have the indigenous and the African and the European, and they're producing new languages and art and music and hybrid racial identities like mestizo and mulattoes. And so by the 1800s, independence movements are sweeping across the continent. Each new nation is forging its identity, and it's doing that amongst struggling and inequality and just this lasting shadow of colonial hierarchy. So for counselors, this history matters because it's still alive in clients' narratives, the stories of oppression and resilience and just this ongoing search for dignity. So understanding these legacies is going to allow us to see our clients not as isolated individuals, but as inheritors of complex historical lineages. So when we talk about Latina or Latino or Hispanic, we're actually referring to people from over 20 different countries across North and Central and South America, and also in the Caribbean. And each of these regions has distinct dialects, foods, and political history. They also have very distinct racial compositions. Like, for example, a Puerto Rican client's experience is going to differ greatly from that of a Guatemalan or somebody from Venezuela or Brazil. But even though, Spanish may connect them linguistically, but the dialects and the idioms are going to differ so widely that even fluent Spanish speakers are going to notice the variations from the different regions. So, like Portuguese is going to dominate Brazil, but we have Haitian Creole and English and indigenous languages appear in other places. So, ethnically, Latin America is going to contain extraordinary racial diversity. So we have white descendants of Europeans, Afro descendants, indigenous people, mixed heritage groups. And because of this range, a person's racial identity in Latin America might not align with the US racial categories. Like a client who was seen as white in Colombia might be viewed as a person of color in Texas and vice versa. So the socioeconomic and the generational differences are going to add a little bit further complexity here because some families have been in the US for generations and others arrived last year. So immigration status, level of acculturation, and English fluency are all going to influence the mental health experience here. So as counselors, the key is to approach every client with cultural curiosity. Never assume that one narrative represents all. So let's start here with Mexican and Mexican American populations. This forms the largest Latino subgroup in the United States. There's about 62% of all people of Latin descent are Mexican. So it's roughly about 36 million people. And about 2/3 of them, or about 66%, were born in the United States, while 1/3, or only 34%, are immigrants. And Mexicans are deeply woven into this country's social and economic fabric, from California to Texas to the Midwest and even beyond that. And educationally, we see an important generational shift. Among the first generation immigrants, college completion is around 14%. So it kind of reflects like barriers like language or documentation or maybe even financial strain. But among the second generation Mexican Americans, that rate nearly doubles to 28%. So this upward trajectory is showing how families are translating sacrifice into opportunity. But it's also bringing new pressures. Like children who advance educationally may experience guilt or cultural dissonance or family tension around their success. And so for counselors, the takeaway is to frame education and assimilation as intergenerational collaboration, not rebellion. And we can help families view progress as, a shared pride rather than a cultural loss. So I want you to pause and think for a second. What images or messages are coming to mind when you hear Mexican or Mexican American? And where do those ideas originate? Was it media portrayals, film, television, news? Those often reinforce extremes, like the hardworking immigrant versus the undocumented criminal, the submissive maid versus the fiery rebel. And these caricatures, they're going to seep into the collective consciousness and can unconsciously color our expectations. So as counselors, we need to unlearn the stereotypes by confronting our exposure to them. So I want you to reflect on how your perceptions were formed and consider the diversity that exists within Mexican American communities, rural or urban, bilingual and monolingual, conservative, progressive, whatever. And this reflection is not about guilt, it's about clarity. So recognizing that internalized media bias is going to help us ensure that our micro behaviors like eye contact and tone and empathy, they're reflecting our genuine respect rather than the inherited assumptions. So Puerto Ricans, they hold a unique place in U.S. society because they are U.S. citizens by birth. Whether they were born on the island or on the mainland, roughly about 5.8 million now live in the continental United States. And they're mostly concentrated in like urban areas like New York, New Jersey, Florida, Illinois. And although, only about 3% are considered foreign born Puerto Ricans, they often navigate a lot of the same challenges as immigrant populations like language adaptation, relocation, and even prejudice. So economically, Puerto Rican are experiencing higher poverty and unemployment rates than both Mexicans and Cuban Americans combined. And they also rely more frequently on public assistance. But their educational attainment often equals or surpasses that of Mexican Americans, and it's actually approaching the levels that we see in the Cuban communities. And in counseling, Puerto Rican clients might grapple with these dual identities. I'm loyal to the island and adapting to the mainland life. And so counselors should be mindful of like post-hurricane displacement trauma, family separation, and just like the ongoing colonial debates surrounding the political status of Puerto Rico. And all of this is going to affect the personal and cultural identity of that person. And then for Cuban Americans, this comprises another very distinct subgroup whose migration patterns and socioeconomic outcomes differ sharply from others. So there was three major waves that shaped Cuban American demographics. So we have the post-1959 revolution, and that's when middle and upper class Cubans were fleeing communism. And then we have the 1980 Mariel boat lift, which included like working class people and marginalized Cubans. And then we have the post 1994 migrants, and this was kind of a mix, seeking economic and political stability. And these migration waves created a community with strong educational and political representation. And approximately 90% of Cuban Americans graduate high school, and 31% hold college degrees. And that's both above the Latino and Latina average. So their median household income hovers near $60,000 as comparatively high. So Cuban Americans, they're especially influential in Florida politics and business. Many view hard work as enterprise and enterprise as like a patriotic duty. But behind this success, this narrative, there's stories of exile, loss, and rebuilding. So counselors should appreciate both the pride and the pain in this identity. And that's going to help the clients reconcile the achievements of diaspora and, with the grief of displacement. And then we have the remaining 28% of the U.S. Latino population, and that's going to include people from the Caribbean and Central America and South America, like the Dominicans, Colombians, Salvadorians, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Venezuelans, Peruvians, and so many more. And immigration from these regions often stems from political instability and poverty and natural disasters or violence. Like Salvadorian and Guatemalan refugees fled civil wars in the 1980s, and Venezuelans today flee the economic collapse. And most are settling in large metro areas like New York, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., where there's some established communities that are providing mutual aid and cultural continuity and safety. So counselors should expect diversity within diversity. Variations in dialect, faith traditions, race, and class. And we have to recognize both the trauma and the tenacity. A lot of clients arrive with just this remarkable resilience because they've navigated war and migration and adaptation. So I just want you to take a few quiet minutes to consider your feelings about the rapid expansion of the U.S. Latina population. How has this demographic shift touched your community or your workplace? And reflect also on like how the media coverage of immigration debates has influenced your perceptions. What stories are dominating the airwaves? Who is speaking and who is silenced? And then ask yourself, what steps can I take to challenge those stereotypes or misinformation in my professional space? This exercise isn't hypothetical. If you're a counselor in the United States today, you're likely going to serve a Latina or a Latino client very soon, if not already. And how you think about them now will shape how you serve them tomorrow. So Latin American cultural frameworks are built around several core relational values that really shape everything from family dynamics to therapy expectations. So familismo emphasizes family unity, loyalty, and mutual support. decisions often, we really consider the collective good rather than the individual preference. So counselors should respect family involvement and avoid interpreting interdependence as a sign of codependence. Personalismo, it values warm, friendly connection over formal distance. So a counselor's empathy and approachability are going to foster trust more than just their credentials alone. And respeto underscores proper conduct towards like elders or authority figures and family hierarchies. So counselors must balance the egalitarian ideals with cultural respect for roles. And lastly, simpatia refers to graciousness and harmony in social interactions. So clients may avoid confrontation or mass distress to preserve peace. So reading nonverbal cues is going to become essential for us. Apparently, when we see somebody as like agreeable, they may just be hiding deep pain. So understanding these values allows counselors to adjust their communication style, inviting openness without violating the cultural etiquette. So the phrase somos inmigrantes, this carries profound emotional weight. It's it was once a declaration of pride and a reminder of struggle. So for a lot of Latin American families, immigration is both the trauma and the triumph that's defining them. Parents they leave everything that's familiar, the language, their loved ones, their professional identity, and they're leaving just so they can secure a better future. And so the children grow up balancing gratitude with guilt. And so we have mixed status families where some members are documented and others are not. And they may live in constant uncertainty, like fear of deportation or economic exploration or exploitation and systemic discrimination. Those are all everyday realities. So in therapy, we have to honor this experience by emphasizing confidentiality and validating courage and exploring the meaning of home and belonging. So we want to ask gentle questions like, what does safety mean to you? And what helps you feel connected to where you come from? Somos Inmigrantes reminds us that migration is not just geography. It is a lifelong process of identity reconstruction. And language is also like a living expression of culture and identity. And Spanish and Portuguese dominate Latin America, but each carries hundreds of regional accents and indigenous loanwords. Clients might switch fluidly between the different languages, and this is called code switching because they're navigating different social worlds. So in counseling, code switching can be both expressive and protective. It's going to allow the clients to communicate emotion precisely, or it might mean that they're trying to conceal vulnerability. So rather than correcting grammar or asking for translation, we can view language shifts as windows into emotion and belonging. Language loss is also another emotional topic. A lot of first generation parents mourn when children prefer English. They kind of interpret it as like a cultural rejection. And then the children in turn may feel embarrassed by accents or translation duties. So exploring these dynamics with empathy can transform the shame into shared understanding. And if you're not bilingual, you can still validate language as identity, like pronounce names correctly, honor the client's linguistic preferences, and use interpreters ethically. These small acts communicate deep respect. And then faith also occupies a central place in a lot of Latin American lives. Roughly 70% of Latin Americans identify as Catholic, but the region also hosts vibrant Protestant, evangelical, and even Pentecostal movements, as well as some indigenous and Afro syncretic practices like the Santeria, um, Candomblé, and curanderismo. So for a lot of clients, spirituality functions as a coping system. It's a source of hope and discipline and community belonging. So like prayer circles, candles, saints, and rituals are going to provide comfort and continuity. And counselors should not shy away from discussing faith. Instead, we want to ask how it influences the client's decisions or their relationships or even meaning making. And at the same time, religion can introduce conflict. Clients might experience guilt about divorce or sexuality or mental illness if these are clashing with the doctrine. So exploring faith not only as a solace, but as a system of values that can both heal and constrain. And integrating spirituality into treatment when you are invited to do so can really strengthen the rapport. Like, for example, reframing some coping skills as spiritual resilience is going to honor belief while promoting the psychological growth of the client. And despite the historical and systemic adversity, Latin American communities are demonstrating extraordinary resilience. Resilience here is collective. It's not merely individual. So it's coming from family solidarity and cultural pride and adaptability. And extended families are going to function as like a social safety net. So the neighbors are going to become kin. Churches and cultural centers are going to serve as anchors of identity. And across generations, resilience is going to evolve. So first generation immigrants are going to show it through sacrifice and endurance. So they're going to work multiple jobs. They're going to send their money home back to the family, and they're persevering through uncertainty. And then their children are going to display it through achievement and advocacy. So they're going to pursue education and challenge discrimination and redefine success. So as counselors, our task is to spotlight these strengths, and we want to ask clients about stories of endurance in their families, like the moments of faith that have sustained them, or maybe some of the traditions that have reminded them of who they are. And when we highlight resilience instead of that deficiency, the clients are going to see themselves not as a victim of circumstance, but kind of like the author of their own survival and hope. And that reframing is really the heart of empowerment for these clients. Gender expectations are going to play a really big role in the emotional and relational lives of Latin American families. So understanding the nuances of machismo and marianismo, that's going to be really critical for us because these constructs are going to influence how clients express emotion, how they relate to other people, and how they define their self-worth. So machismo is often misunderstood outside of Latin contexts. In a lot of communities, machismo isn't just about domination. It's about honor and dignity and courage and the duty to protect and provide. It's kind of like the male norm in the United States. So a man who is fulfilling his obligations to his family is seen as honorable. And the traditional male is expected to be a strong moral leader. He's a provider and the figure of stability. But when this ideal meets the pressures of migration and poverty or unemployment, it's going to transform into frustration and control or emotional withdrawal. Kind of like here in America, that's kind of how it is in the standard 2.5 kid family. You know, the man is the provider and the protector, and if that man loses his job, he's not going to feel like a provider or protector anymore. So it translates the same. And so they're going to emotionally withdraw or become frustrated or even try to control other people because they don't feel like they have control over themselves or their own lives. And so counselors might hear these male clients express guilt or shame over not being a real man if they lose their job or they can't support their families in a way that they wish. And these emotional conflicts are going to manifest as anger or depression or even avoidance of help-seeking behaviors because emotional vulnerability might be seen as a weakness. And Marianismo is derived from the Virgin Mary. So it idealizes women as like self-sacrificing, they're nurturing, they're pure. And a lot of Latino women are socialized to prioritize others, especially their husbands, their children, and their elders before themselves. And this can bring really deep satisfaction, but also emotional exhaustion. So, for example, a woman might express her needs to maintain peace, or she might hesitate to pursue her own goals because of guilt or fear of disrupting family harmony. So, counselors must approach this dynamic with empathy, helping women redefine self care as a form of strength rather than selfishness. And I can tell you, as a Latina woman, that even I feel this this need to make sure that everybody else is taken care of before I take care of myself. And I would often feel guilty for going to take a shower at the end of the day, because my husband might have to watch the kids. And so I felt guilty asking him to watch the kids. And so oftentimes I would wait until after they went to bed so that I could go take a shower instead of taking a shower earlier on in the day and getting enough sleep at night. So I was often waking up with bags under my eyes because I was just so exhausted because I had to stay up late because I didn't want my husband having to take care of the kids. So it's kind of bred into Latina women to make sure that everybody else is taken care of first. And we have to, as counselors, help women redefine what that self-care is for them and help them to understand that it is not selfish, it is a form of strength. And as acculturation occurs, gender roles are going to evolve. Second generation men are going to feel torn between machismo's protective ideals and the Western expectations of like being emotionally open. And women may adopt more assertive communication styles or pursue education while facing family criticism for being too Americanized. And counselors can help the clients navigate this duality by validating both the cultural pride in traditional values and the personal growth that comes with redefining gender identity. The goal isn't to fix machismo or Marianismo, but to help the clients integrate the positive aspects of each of these with like the modern expressions of equality and compassion and partnership. So family, or La Familia, is the nucleus of Latin life and a primary source of emotional and financial and spiritual support. So it extends far beyond the nuclear unit. Grandparents, cousins, godparents, and close friends are often going to function as kin. And these relationships create a kind of a web of belonging that cushions the stress and sustains identity and reinforces those values. And family decision making is typically collective and it's interdependent. So choices about career and marriage or relocation are often going to involve consultation with parents or elders. So a family member's success brings honor to the whole family, while failure or shame can ripple through the group. So for counselors raised in more individualistic cultures, it's going to be important to recognize that autonomy is not always the ultimate goal. Interdependence is often viewed as a strength. So within this system, family reputation, which is called El Respeto de la Familia, is going to carry moral weight. Protecting family image can sometimes discourage members from disclosing maybe some personal struggles like domestic violence or even substance abuse. So as a counselor, we have to create a sense of safety that's going to allow our clients to speak freely without that fear of betraying their family honor. Some interventions that involve family participation are often going to yield stronger outcomes. Inviting maybe some trusted relatives into sessions, or at least acknowledging their influence, is going to help align the therapy with those cultural norms. Even when working one-on-one, counselors can respect familial values by exploring how decisions might affect the wider family network. So relationships in Latin American culture are built on warmth and respect and genuine human connection. So this emphasis is captured by two guiding values, personalismo and confianza. Personalismo is emphasizing genuine warmth and interpersonal closeness. So Latin clients often prefer personal interactions over impersonal transactions. So, for example, they may expect their counselor to ask about their family, smile, share small personal details before discussing clinical matters. Um, a purely professional demeanor might come across as like cold or detached to these clients. Personalismo doesn't blur boundaries, it really humanizes them, and it tells the client, you see me and I matter. Confianza goes a little bit deeper. It's not just about trust, it's about mutual respect. It's about confidentiality and emotional safety. So when confianza is established, clients are often going to open up fully, and they're going to share deeply personal or maybe family matters that they might not otherwise tell you, or they might keep it private. But confianza can't be rushed. Counselors earn it through consistent reliability and active listening and cultural sensitivity. So in practice, this means being mindful of language and tone. We want to use culturally appropriate greetings and maintain a friendly but professional warmth. We want to show genuine curiosity about that client's background so we can build rapport with them. When confianza is present, the therapy transforms from a clinical exchange into this collaborative relationship that's really rooted in respect. So let's look at this case study. Juan is a 15-year-old second-generation Hispanic American. His mother is a 44-year-old Cuban-born U.S. citizen, and his father is a 54-year-old Colombian-born U.S. citizen. And both his mother and father immigrated separately to the southeastern United States in 1970, and they were considered first immigration immigrants. So they still live in the same city that they moved to over 30 years ago. It's an urban center that's known for its strong Latino presence, and it really celebrates Latin American cultures. But unlike their son, they identify themselves as the mom as Cubana and the dad as Colombiano, and they don't really consider themselves Hispanic or Hispanic American or Hispano, or even Latino or Latina. And Juan also has an older brother who's in his mid-20s who lives outside of the home. And his brother is also a second-generation American, but his older brother identifies himself as Latino. If someone asks them, like typically coworkers and new acquaintances, and so on. So lately, Juan's been having a few misunderstandings with his parents over his adopting of American values, or as his parents are putting it, valores americanos. So his parents are defining these values as too much freedom, too much independence, you're acting older than you are, you're not responsible for your actions, you're putting too much focus on your friends and being cool instead of focusing on your family. And this has caused a lot of strain in Juan's immediate household. And then on the other hand, Juan wants his parents to understand that some of their customs and traditions and values don't apply to this country or this era. And on the other hand, his parents can't understand why Juan fails to see that adhering to those traditional customs and values, like wanting to spend time with family first and seeking the advice of and the input of the family members when you make decisions, and like having that intrinsic desire to practice and use the Spanish language, they've all benefited them and their older son, and therefore they should work just fine for Juan. So in an attempt to reconcile issues in the home, Juan's parents are seeking advice and input from his older brother. They're also asking the Cuban grandmother and their friends from church and extended family members. And in contrast, Juan is seeking support from his high school friends, his girlfriend, and on occasion, his older brother. So in the end, Juan simply just wants his parents to understand him better and, as he put it, get off my back a bit. And his parents, on the contrary, want Juan to, quote, act more responsibly. And they want him to focus more on his family and his studies and less on his friends and their bad influences. So this family tension is illustrating a common dynamic that's known as acculturation gap distress. Parents are often maintaining their native cultural values while the children are assimilating faster. And that's going to create conflicting expectations. One is seeing his independence as just normal teenage behavior. And his parents are interpreting it as rebellion or disrespect. So as a counselor, it's vital to validate both sides. We might explain to one's parents that in American adolescence, seeking independence is developmental. It's not disloyal. And simultaneously, we can help one understand his parents' fears. They sacrifice deeply to build a stable life and view his autonomy as risky. So counseling interventions may include family dialogue sessions, values mapping, exercises where each family member is sharing their hopes and fears. The counselor is going to act as a cultural translator because we're going to bridge communication styles and reduce some of those misinterpretations. And one story also reminds us that acculturation is not linear. Even second generation youth are often going to face identity conflicts. Like, am I American enough for my peers? Am I Latin enough for my family? And therapy should provide a safe space for that exploration without forcing a resolution. So, how do you conceptualize the cultural values of both Juan and his parents? And what individual differences play into these conflicting values for Juan and his parents? How would you work with this family in counseling? And what sources of resiliency do you note for Juan? And how might your cultural values and cultural statuses impact your work with this family? So there's no monolithic Latino experience. Every client's story is a tapestry that's woven from multiple threads: nationality, race, class, generation, gender, faith, personal history. Some identify as white presenting, others as Afro-Latino or maybe indigenous. Some are bilingual, others speak only English. Some were raised in conservative Catholic homes, other in secular or interfaith environments. And so for counselors, cultural humility is essential. This means asking rather than assuming. We want to explore rather than label. So instead of relying on generalized cultural models, we want to invite clients to teach you what their lived reality is. So we might ask, like, how does your culture influence the way that you see yourself? Or what values do you hold most strongly? Or what aspects of your background have shaped who you are today? And when we do this, we're going to move from stereotyping to authentic understanding. Immigration status is going to profoundly affect safety and trust and mental health. Clients from these mixed status families, where some members are citizens and others are undocumented, they can often live in constant anxiety. A knock at the door, a police siren, or an unknown phone call can trigger fear of deportation. Even lawful permanent residents can experience hypervigilance or mistrust due to the political stuff that's going on about immigration. They might avoid seeking therapy. They might fear that personal disclosures could jeopardize their status. And so counselors must explicitly affirm confidentiality and clarify those boundaries of mandated reporting. And establishing that safety early in the relationship is going to allow the healing to begin. So in counseling, we want to explore the emotional cost of displacement. A lot of undocumented clients carry grief and guilt and shame for leaving their family behind. And they may also struggle with chronic financial stress or exploitative labor conditions. So addressing those realities is going to require trauma-informed, advocacy-based care. And sometimes that means connecting the clients to legal or community resources. So let's do a little reflection here. Due to the current contentious immigration debate in the US, it's quite possible that some Latina or Latino clients will come into your office to discuss their experiences, either directly or vicariously through like a family member, a friend, or another source. And it's going to be about racism and discrimination. So, how do you suppose that your stance towards the immigration debate might facilitate or hinder your work with clients wanting to talk about immigration related issues? This reflection is going to challenge you to examine your own beliefs and biases around immigration. I want you to consider your personal stance. Whether you're politically neutral or supportive or skeptical, that's going to subtly shape your tone, your language, and your empathy during your sessions. And imagine a client sharing fears about deportation or discrimination. How would your facial expression be? What are your word choices going to be? Or, you know, is your silence going to communicate safety or judgment? Cultural competence is going to require some self-awareness first. Reflect on where your information about immigration is coming from. Is it the media, your personal experience, stereotypes? Your goal isn't to change your political beliefs, it's to ensure that no client is going to feel dismissed or unseen because of them. And when counselors can model empathy without political debate, they're creating a sanctuary for healing. So let's talk about generational differences for a second. These differences are going to create rich but challenging family dynamics. So we have first generation immigrants. They're often carrying nostalgia for their homeland, and they might experience language barriers and isolation or even a loss of status. So their emotional world often revolves around sacrifice and hope. And then second generational individuals are cultural navigators. They're often feeling too American for their parents, but they're too ethnic for their peers. So they might experience guilt for acculturating faster and resentment for the cultural restrictions. And then we have third generation and beyond might experience cultural dilution, less fluency in Spanish, fewer traditions, but they may later seek reconnection through cultural pride movements. So counselors can facilitate intergenerational empathy by helping families discuss what each generation is valuing, what they fear losing, and what they wish to preserve. And socioeconomic realities are deeply going to influence mental health. Latina or Latino communities, they're going to experience higher poverty rates and limited access to healthcare and education. And a lot of clients are going to juggle multiple low-wage jobs and caregiving and financial stress. But within these struggles are stories of resilience. We have entrepreneurship and faith-based mutual aid and intergenerational cooperation. So counselors have to resist pathologizing the poverty. Instead, we want to explore the systemic forces that shape the client's challenges while also affirming their dignity and their survival skills. Economic stress can really strain family roles. Children may work early or translate for their parents. Adults may feel guilt for relying on public aid. So therapy should balance empowerment with structural awareness, addressing both the individual coping and the systemic advocacy. And Latina and Latino individuals are going to face barriers to mental health services like language limitations, cost, transportation, and stigma. In a lot of families, mental illness is going to be seen as a weakness or maybe even a spiritual imbalance rather than a medical concern. So a lot of common issues are going to be like depression, anxiety, trauma, and they're going to have somatic complaints like headaches or fatigue. So counselors have to recognize that these symptoms may be communicated through physical or relational language, like I'm tired all the time, or I just can't focus, or my nerves are bad. We might hear those kinds of things. Faith and family are going to be protective factors here. So inviting discussion of these spiritual beliefs and prayer or community support is only going to enhance the trust. And at the same time, it's going to normalize counseling as compatible with their faith, not a replacement for it. Acculturative stress is going to come from navigating between two different cultures. So parents are often going to hold traditional values while children are going to adapt to the new norms faster. and that's going to create power reversals. So a common scenario is that like the child becomes the family's interpreter, and so they're translating at doctor's appointments or government offices. And while empowering, this role is exposing them to adult responsibilities and also the emotional burdens in the family. And then parents, in turn, are going to feel powerless or ashamed. So in therapy, we validate both sides. We want to encourage families to negotiate new boundaries, maybe by sharing tasks or using professional interpreters. We want to empower our clients to see adaptation not as a betrayal, but as resilience in motion. And migration is really entailing invisible grief. Clients may have left behind their parents or their friends or entire communities and parts of their identity. And that loss is ongoing. The homeland still exists, but it feels unreachable. It's producing this ambiguous grief. And this grief may surface as sadness or irritability or even somatic complaints. So as counselors, we help the clients name it, ritualize it, integrate it into their story. So we need to ask them, like, what do you miss the most? What keeps your homeland close to your heart? We want to encourage symbolic connection through music or food or language. And that helps the clients honor what was lost while embracing what remains. And a lot of our Latino or Latina clients are facing intersecting challenges like domestic violence and substance abuse, depression, unemployment, housing insecurity. We have teenage pregnancy and school dropout rates. They're higher in these under-resourced communities, but they really reflect systemic inequalities, not moral failings. So counselors can reduce the stigma by reframing these problems as understandable reactions to that chronic stress or poverty or discrimination. And we want to collaborate with local agencies and faith groups and cultural organizations to create some holistic support networks for these people. And I want us to do an activity really quick. In this exercise, I want you to think like a cultural investigator. How might you ask questions that uncover how cultural stressors are affecting your clients' well-beings? I want you to compile a list of questions that we can use with our Latino individuals and families to assess the relationship between what are their cultural stressors and their counseling concerns. Consider what your setting is. Is it a school counseling agency, a community college, vocational rehab, addiction counseling? How might that context shape your questions? Some examples might be like, what was it like to adjust to life here? Or who supports you when things get difficult? Or are there traditions that bring you comfort? We want to tailor our approach to our setting. So in schools, we want to explore language and identity conflicts. In community centers, we want to ask about access and discrimination. In college counseling, we want to focus on belonging and family expectations. The key here is curiosity, not assumption. So the counseling needs and strengths and goals and objectives of United States Latinas or Latinos, they're going to vary according to age and immigration status and country of origin, where they're living in the United States, what their economic and socioeconomic status are, what's their language preference, what's their assimilation. That's just a few of the factors. So let's look at a couple of considerations about counseling interventions for our Latina clients based primarily on age. And what's purposely absent from this discussion is kind of the type of theoretical orientation to use with them. Counseling theories and techniques have been demonstrated as effective with Latino or Latina clients, including cognitive behavioral therapy, person-centered therapy, psychodynamic theory, solution-focused therapy. All of these we can use. And the literature seems to lend a little bit more support for using cognitive behavioral therapy and directive theories with Latina or Latino clients. And so when we're working with these clients, we shouldn't assume like this one size fits all mentality when we decide on which theories and techniques to use with these individuals. we should just really explore how these ideas are fitting within our theoretical preferences. So effective counseling with Latin clients is going to require humility, flexibility, and advocacy. So always start by acknowledging culture as a central part of the client's worldview and avoid imposing Western individualism. Collaboration is a lot more meaningful than independence. We want to include family and faith supports whenever it's appropriate and ask open-ended questions about beliefs, traditions, and barriers. Like when systemic issues come up, like racism or immigration fears, we want to address them directly, not as tangential stressors, but as legitimate clinical concerns. And when counseling children, we want to assess how cultural expectations are shaping their self-concept. Are they praised for obedience or independence? Are they proud or embarrassed by their bilingualism? A lot of Latin children are navigating these two worlds daily, home and school, and each one of these is going to have different rules and languages. So the counselors have to normalize this bicultural balancing act and celebrate it as a strength. So play-based and creative techniques are going to help children express these complex feelings that they can't yet articulate. We want to use storytelling and drawing or bilingual activities. Parents might expect directive advice rather than exploratory play, so explain your rationale clearly to gain some buy-in from the parents. Reinforce their cultural pride through like family storytellings or traditions or language celebration. So Cuento therapy was first introduced into the counseling literature by Constantino Malgadi and Rogler in 1986, and Cuento translates into fairy tale in Spanish. And Constantino and the rest of the researchers use this counseling modality to model desirable social behaviors for Puerto Rican children. And the stories that they used were based on Puerto Rican lore, and they included Puerto Rican heroes and cultural concepts and locales. So in essence, Cuento therapy is similar to bibliotherapy, but instead of reading a book on bullying, like The Three Little Pigs, and leading a group or individual discussion with a child, the counselor is sharing a narrative folk story with the child or children, and then processing the events and characters in the story. So the stories were unique in the Puerto Rican children in Constantino's study. They felt like they could identify with the Cuentos characters, the situation, the language. And in turn, Constantino is using the children's identification with the characters and the themes to facilitate their discussions and use of the positive social behaviors inside and outside of the counseling sessions. And of course, here, the biggest hurdle for most counselors who want to use Cuento therapy is, where do we find the cuentos? But the best place to start would be like to ask the parents or guardians for some cuentos, particularly those with like a strong hero figure or clear notions of like right versus wrong or a problem and its solution or its resolution. And it might be necessary to maybe consult with a translator if the parent's not fluent in English or like comfortable communicating in English. The children themselves could teach the counselor about cuentos with which they're already familiar. And parents and children are some really great people to ask. They're going to relay stories that are unique to their culture or their country of origin. So it's going to decrease the likelihood of using a cuento that may not be familiar to the child. So as counselors, we want to accumulate cuentos because they can incorporate these stories into our counseling sessions with the Latino or Latina children. But before we use a cuento in counseling session with the children, we should be familiar with the characters and the themes and the outcome of the story and really be able to link those events to like the expected counseling goals and objectives. It's not necessary for the counselor to tell the cuento in Spanish, but we just want to be able to translate the general concepts and the characters to the child's needs. So Cuento therapy is really just a great way to demonstrate the counselor's willingness to bring culture into a counseling session while increasing the connection between therapeutic goals and culture. So, for example, a counselor's eagerness to learn and adapt and implement the Latin Cuento into a counseling session with a young girl who's experiencing maybe some acculturative stress is going to show the child just how important that her culture is, by associating the child herself to the counselor. So it's just kind of a genuine attempt to bridge the cultural traditions with the folklore, with the counseling process, and it can kind of assuage the child's acculturative stress, and that familiar story is, being shared in the counseling session. So in the long run, the counselor's effort to use Cuento therapy may help the child understand the counseling process even more, and they're going to contribute to the counseling relationship. So moving on here to counseling considerations for adolescents in the Latin descent, the schools play an important role in development, and they also play an important role in socialization of teenagers. So we have to pay close attention to like the academic experiences of these adolescent clients that are Latino or Latina, and we have peer pressure and puberty and adjustments to more rigorous academic material, and they need to fit in. And so that can be difficult for a lot of middle schoolers and high school students. And so for the U.S. Latina and Latino youth, however, these issues may be kind of aggravated by English proficiency, a need to balance between their home and their school cultures, and there may be some limited parental involvement in school and social interests. And due to the increased probability that these adolescent parents attended school outside of the U.S., they were socialized in their native countries. And so they typically have traditional expectations for their kids, and that conflict is going to tend to come up with the first generation Latina and Latino parents and then their U.S. teenagers. And regardless of where their children are born, this might still be an issue. So counselors working with them have to address this type of quality of relationships that they have with their parents and the other family members. And it's going to also help the counselor to find out what the parents' perspectives are, really of the relationship, and what are some of those factors that are positively and negatively influencing the relationships. So we need to be aware of a couple of issues. One, adolescents' difficulty reconciling their bicultural status. Another is the adolescent's feelings toward adhering to those gender-related expectations in the face of American values. And then what is their sexual orientation development, particularly as it's relating to males and the culture's intolerance for homosexuality. And then, what is the adolescent's limited exposure to like culturally related extracurricular school activities and sports an issue for them? What are some potential substance use issues? Maybe they're using it as coping mechanisms for stress. What's their level of experience and exposure to various career opportunities, as well as like determining what their career models are. So individual counseling interventions are an effective way for helping Latin children or teenagers deal with, for example, some of the pressures associated with being bicultural. Counselors, we can organize one-on-one sessions so that our adolescent clients can really talk about the struggles to fit in at school with their peers, while also kind of adhering to those parents' wishes and their cultural mores. So individual counseling, we can use that to kind of help the teenagers gain a little bit of insight from their experiences, while also at the same time helping them frame some of their bicultural skills as assets instead of detriments. Group counseling, particularly the psychoeducational groups, that can really be an effective method for helping Latin boys and girls deal with gender socialization struggles. Think about the gender socialization like machismo or marianismo, and it's often going to add, or it's going to be at odds really with certain notions that we have of like gender socializations in the U.S. And so the counselor-led groups are going to be organized for high school-aged youth, and that's going to give males and females sort of this medium to discuss those issues around being macho or being matronly and pure, or having to support the family, or sacrificing college for being a good wife and mother. And not all Latin adolescents, particularly the third generation immigrants and beyond, are going to experience a conflict with the gender roles. But it would behoove the counselors to at least ask these clients if any related issues are concerning them. And then we want to include immediate and extended family members when counseling adolescents. But it can be tricky. Some teens are resistant to their parents' suggestions, ideas, and even their presence due to the normal conflicts that come up between parents and children during adolescence. But that shouldn't lead us to omit the participation of the family members when we counsel Latin adolescents. So, for example, like brief strategic family therapy, or BSFT, has really shown to be effective when we're helping Latin adolescents with substance use and like behavioral issues. And while the success of the BSFT with the Latin youth can be partially attributed to like the overall effectiveness of the technique, it also supports the power of familismo and the family system in Latin families. And so basically, there's some tenets of BSFT that are going to help us. And, we need to do a little bit more reading and research so that we can fully implement this technique within like the U.S. Latin adolescents. And just thinking about Latin adolescents, they're often juggling identity confusion and peer pressure and family expectations. Maybe they're expected to act as, family role models while they're navigating the discrimination or academic challenges. And so we want to encourage open dialogue about bicultural pride and stress. We want to use group discussions, journaling, role play, so that we can explore these dual identities and reassure the parents that, independence doesn't necessarily equal disrespect. It's a developmental milestone. And when the adolescents express anger or withdrawal, maybe consider cultural stressors. Are they caught between contradictory values, or are they maybe facing subtle racism? Helping them voice these conflicts is going to reduce that internalized shame. So according to Santisteban in 2003, BSFT, or brief strategic family therapy, is really just this 3-phase counseling technique where the counselor is going to join with the diagnosis and restructure the family communication patterns in hopes of making the parents the primary source of authority, and where all individuals are going to have equal opportunities to contribute to the family and to voice their issues and their concerns. So in this joining phase, the counselor is going to help the family members analyze and process their communication and their interactions. Because what we do is we summarize and we paraphrase the family's emotions and behaviors. And we emphasize that they're interacting in their typical manner. And so this process is going to lead to the diagnosing phase, where the counselor is looking for some of the patterns of the problems and the issues that are related to power distribution between the family members. Maybe looking for some of the targeted family members, maybe some boundary irregularities. What are some avenues for conflict resolution? And then all of that collected information is going to direct the counselor in developing a restructured plan that we can present to the family, and it's going to have a little bit more effective, realistic, and appropriate communication methods and interactions for them. And so with U.S. Latin adolescents involved in like generational conflicts, particularly those who are, in the eyes of their parents or older family members, rebelling against the old ways, BSFT can really help them and their families just take a time out from that culture-centered and generational-centered infighting, and really gauge why their communication patterns are not leading to family cohesion and solutions to some of that discord. And so counselors who join U.S. Latin families really can help the clients to observe like the adaptive and the maladaptive communication styles and what are some of the topics of disagreement so that we can diagnose where the actual problems are centered. And then by providing support for the adult's role as the authority figure, while also acknowledging like that every family member's voice is valid, the counselor is really going to help the family member to develop some methods for attaining stronger and healthier relationships. And just like with most techniques, mental health experts are really ethically required to explore and research its merits. And once counselors become a little bit more comfortable with the basic tenets of BSFT, they're going to find that it is a good counseling technique when we're looking at like cultural norms and customs for Latin adolescents and their families. So it's going to increase the likelihood of being an effective clinical tool. So let's look at this case study here. Sandra is a 14-year-old Mexican-American child. She was born in the U.S., but her parents were born in Mexico. And so she's been referred to a community counseling center where you are working alongside her middle school counselor. And the middle school counselor is a colleague of yours from graduate school. And the colleague informs you that Sandra is experiencing family issues at home and that these issues are manifesting themselves in the school. And that's including apathetic attitude towards her schoolwork, aggression towards her classmates, disrespectful behavior towards school personnel. She's elaborating on the issues in the home by saying that Sandra's at odds with her parents' child rearing practices, in that, saying that, her parents are much more strict than Sandra's peers' parents. But Sandra's parents are going back to Mexico this summer for the entire 3 months of summer vacation, and Sandra does not want to go with them. She'd rather be left with an aunt who lives in a nearby town. And then your colleague informs you that Sandra has reported being fed up with all this speaking Spanish stuff in the house. Spanish TV, Spanish radio, tortillas for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I just wish I was more American like my friends and not Mexican. And so the parents have agreed with the school counselor that a community counseling referral would be more beneficial for Sandra, and you agree to see her. So considering that you are going to have an intake session with Sandra in the next week, what kind of information do you want to know from this session? What might not be on the intake form that you might want to know? And then assuming that you're going to do a mental status exam as part of that intake, what kinds of formal or informal assessments are you going to include? What cultural considerations would you need to account for as you're completing the mental status exam? What are some of the cultural limitations of the mental status exam process? And to what extent would you involve her parents in the intake session? And then to what extent would we involve them in the subsequent sessions? And how would you deal with that generational conflict in your sessions? How would you address the generational conflicts outside of session, where they're more likely to occur? And there are 2 tiers of circumstances here. We have the school's concerns and the family home cultural identity concerns. So how do you prioritize these issues and why? What kind of theoretical orientation and techniques would you use to address those concerns? And what kinds of goals for Sandra or her family would you assist in formulating? How would you achieve this goal formulation? And how would you know when these goals have been attained? And what kind of countertransference issues are you experiencing as a result of reading the case study, if any? And how are you grappling with these concerns and self-awareness, and how are you addressing it? So just take a few moments to stop here, press pause, answer these questions in your handout. So when we work with Latin adults, it's important for us to consider the impact of immigration status and also the practice of cultural or religious customs, particularly for those first generation adult Latin people. Their immigration status really is a constant stressor if they don't have the proper documentation to reside in the country. And It can also be a source of pride if they have successfully become a U.S. resident or citizen, or maybe a guilt if they experience feelings of having to sacrifice their affiliation with their country of origin for that U.S. citizenship. And then even for like the second generation U.S. Latin residents and some of the people that have lived here, immigration issues can really have an influence on their daily lives. Like for example, here, 54% of legal Latin residents and citizens have reported increased discrimination as a direct result of their contentious immigration debate in the U.S. So they also worry about their immigration status and visa procedures for loved ones in the United States and those trying to move to the United States. So we shouldn't assume that immigration is a non-issue for our U.S. Latin population, regardless of their status. The amount of time that adult has lived in the United States can really influence the vigor with which they're adhering to the norms and the customs and the traditions, and even like rebellious practice. The sacrifice or the mere fading of their heritage in the name of becoming American can result in some feelings of guilt in a lot of adults, kind of feeling like they're selling out to their, they're selling out their homeland. And so these circumstances can really be moderated by where the client is living. So if they're, do they live in a community that has a large Latino presence historically, like Miami, New York, has the client settled down in a more rural community that has a smaller Latino populace. So looking at some of those things, we really need to be aware that, adults can struggle when they're caring for their elderly parents in a society that they don't consider being as respectful of the elderly as the Latino cultures do. Some of these adults are going to experience discrimination in the workplace, or they may be underemployed as a result of their educational attainment or their immigration status. It's difficult for them to connect with their children because of the differences between school culture and home culture. And they might feel a little bit powerless because they're depending on their children to serve as translators if the child's English fluency is greater than their own. And they might feel the need to send money back to their family members or friends or creditors in their native countries while struggling to reach economic stability here in the United States. So a lot of our Latin clients may present with burnout, anxiety, guilt, and that's often tied to that work-family balance. A lot of them are caretakers for both the children and the elders, which is known as like a sandwich generation. Economic instability, discrimination, these are all going to amplify stress. But cultural pride and spirituality, they're going to serve as buffers. So we want to incorporate narrative therapy, exploring some of those migration stories as a source of identity and purpose. Reframe resilience not as survival alone, but as transformation, because our clients are the architects of legacy and hope. So let's look at a case study here. Alejandro is a 54-year-old Honduran man, and he came to the U.S. 24 years ago. So he's only been a U.S. citizen for 7 years, though, and he was recently laid off from his job as a supervisor for a textile company, and he had 26 garment workers under his management. And he was laid off because of the downturn in the economy. So for this reason, he came to you, a vocational counselor, in an effort to find employment in a related field. So typically you would start off the first session with a new client by asking for some background on, what their past jobs are, assessing their interests and their skills. But you realize that Alejandro has a lot more that he would like to discuss, than just finding a new job. So in his first session, he's sharing how lost he feels that he can't provide for his family. And he knows that age is not going to help him get a new job since, any employer is just going to hire a younger person with less experience and not pay him a living wage. And you may realize that there are some more pressing concerns for this gentleman than finding a new job. And you know that Many cultural aspects are you're going to need to consider as you're proceeding to offer him vocational guidance. So, how are you going to balance vocational guidance and emotional support here? So, this is an eco map. We used to call them ecological genograms. So, it was developed by Hartman in 1995. And these eco maps are visual depictions of systems that are influencing a person's world. So, it's a little bit unlike a genogram because there's a focus on someone's family history. And the echo map takes into account microsystems like the individual and their family, and also mesosystems like the relationship between the systems, and exosystems, which are like systems indirectly connected to the person or their family, like their work, school, church, etc. And then we have macro systems like religion, spirituality, political systems, things like that. So basically, a counselor using an echo map with a client would ask the client to draw a circle in the middle of the page, and that represents the client or their self. And then the client can draw family members in separate circles, their place of work, or their place of worship. And greater themes like spirituality and the power of government on their life, they can include those as well. And so the client's instructed to draw those systems in circles too. And then more importantly, the client's then instructed to carefully consider where they place each circle in relationship to the self. Because distance from themselves to other individuals and systems is going to indicate importance or closeness or inconsequence, maybe like remoteness. And then we're going to instruct the client to say, to just say a little bit more, right, about those relationships between the self and the system. So we want them to use different types of lines to indicate the type of relationship. Like a straight line might indicate a positive relationship. A dotted line might signify an indifferent relationship. A jagged line would indicate a strained or negative relationship. What the lines represent is up to the counselor. But the final part of this activity is going to be to discuss the client's reactions to this echo map and maybe develop some future clinical goals or focus. What makes an echo map particularly useful with Latin clients, especially the adults, is how to open up discussions into it. For example, like extended family members, or how we open up a discussion on the influence of church or the strain of their U.S. residency uncertainty. And so counselors, when we use eco maps with Latin clients, we need to stress the importance of placing a lot of the relevant systems as possible. But we also want to have the client focus on like what makes the mesosystems take on the characteristics that they do. And if that client is intent on altering the mesosystems, like bringing a family member closer or redefining the importance of school and church, then the echo map is going to provide a visual cue for how things look now and how they want them to look in the future. Echo maps don't really have to be culturally sensitive by definition, but when we use them if we're a culturally competent counselor, then they're going to be helpful and useful and for us and for our Latino clients, because it's going to help our clients realize the importance of all the systems that impact their daily lives. So I kind of did this one all at the same level, but some of these are, when the client did this one, they did it further out. The U.S.-Venezuela relationship, that one was a little bit further out for the client. Their job was farther out. The healthcare system was further out. The church is further out. But U.S. immigration policy is a little bit further in, and the closest things to them were husband, child, and school. Even the sister is further out with a dotted line. And then the U.S. education system, that one's not quite as far out as the mother. The mother was a little bit further out. And there's a strained relationship you can see here with the mother because the line is jagged. So this hypothetical eco map, let's say it's completed by your client, a 27-year-old legal U.S. resident who comes to the United States from Venezuela. when she was 10 years old. So she's indicating that her 6-year-old son and her husband are the most positive and strong relationships that she has, but she doesn't have much contact with her sister back in Venezuela, and she's estranged from her mother, who lives in the same city as herself. And so the relevant exosystems are going to be the community college, where she's pursuing her studies to become a licensed practicing nurse, and then her job, although she's indicating an indifferent relationship between the local Catholic Church. And she's mentioning that, she wants to increase her family's participation in those church activities. And then she mentions that her husband's pending immigration status, like his worker visa, has expired, and he's waiting for an update on when it's going to be renewed. And the current state of the U.S. immigration policy, and that's coupled with the strained relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela, all of this has her worried if he's going to be deported back to Venezuela before the paperwork's completed. But she doesn't want to sound anti-American, because she's grateful for the U.S. education and healthcare systems. So this next activity is going to have you really immerse yourself in a Latin cultural experience in your community. And this is going to be something that you don't have experience in. So maybe find a Spanish religious service, eat at a new Latin restaurant that's not Mexican, visit a community center serving Latin residents. But before you do any of these, I want you to write down a list of 10 expectations or assumptions about your forthcoming cultural immersion. And then after you've engaged in that activity, I want you to revisit your list and see which of your expectations or assumptions were upheld and which ones were negated. And then I want you to compare your level of comfort and or maybe your anxiety before and after the cultural immersion exercise, because this activity is inviting experiential learning. So we want to attend a local Latin festival, a church service, or art exhibit, something that's culturally appropriate, and make that list of assumptions beforehand and then reflect on it afterward. Notice your body's reaction. Are you comfortable? Are you curious? Defensive? Growth only happens when we're aware, and that awareness is meeting humility. Real cultural understanding begins when we allow lived experience to replace stereotypes. So to kind of wrap all this up, U.S. Latin clients are going to span all kinds of races and all kinds of religions. They're residing in all parts of the United States. They're possessing a multitude of strengths. And these clients are exposed to a variety of stressors, and that's compounded by the systems set up to support them. Family, culture, government, their work setting, their local communities. So these Latin clients that are seeking assistance from counselors should, at the very least, be able to expect to work with a professional who has knowledge about the unique and expansive U.S. Latino or Latina experience. And so the intent of this lesson was to give you a little bit of information as it relates to potential Latin clients, and how we decide as counselors to incorporate this information into our professional skills and repertoire is really up to the person. Counseling Latin clients is complex, but it's a necessary endeavor. And unless counselors are comfortable enough with their own shortcomings to ask their Latin clients for information on their family or a country of origin or immigration or cultural experience, that counseling relationship is going to suffer from too many cultural assumptions and misconnections. So it's going to be important for us to take the information provided here on the richness that is the Latin experience as just a mere sabor, or a taste, and use these ideas and concepts and the activities is kind of like a foundation for future exploration into the lives of Latin children and adolescents and adults.